Wow, that was the perfect introduction to some wild places. What great imagery. My family and I had the pleasure of visiting the Keweenaw last year, and it's just as breathtaking as on that video. So today I'd like to introduce our guests. We have Phyllis Green, who's the Park Superintendent of Royale National Park, just a stone's throw, a really long stone's throw from the Keweenaw Peninsula. And Marian Stranak, who is the past park superintendent of Point Pelee National Park in Canada, in Ontario, Canada, not too far from Windsor and from Detroit, Michigan. So thank you for coming here today. It's really neat to have both of you here because you have very similar positions and very similar careers, but in two places that are very distant from one another. Both distant in time, like billions of years distant, but also in true distance. You know, it's going to take you a long day's drive to get from one place to the other. But one place is Marian, where you work in Point Pelee. It's fairly new, 10,000 years old, newly hydrodynamic in the place. Phyllis, where you work, is a billion or so years old, so quite long. But I want to get back to that as we saw there with Mr. Keweenaw, that personal connection. Phyllis, you were telling me earlier today before we started that you helped protect some of those places in that video with a bake sale.
Well, yeah. They showed you Estevan pines, which is pretty phenomenal, similar to Heartwood pines in the southern peninsula. But when I was about 16, the leader to try to save those pines was Jim Rook, and he engaged the youth of the area. And so basically we were doing bake sales and whatever we could, and I don't know if we really raised more a couple than $1,000, where he was after tens of thousands to buy that spot, but we were able to do it. And then my other kind of early experiences, when the DNR Commission had a discussion about whether the Porcupine Wilderness should become Wilderness a state park, I went and spoke in front of the commissioners downstate here at about age 16 or 17, saying that I fully supported that it should be a wilderness area. But the interesting discussion was 2 speakers later, my father got up and he goes, that young woman before me, I'm very proud of her, but we don't always agree. And he said, basically, she represents youth, I represent the aged. And for me, if it goes to wilderness, it will be more difficult to access. I won't be able to get in there. And so he gave a totally different perspective, and actually my dinner time conversations were always all over the board, which I think helps me be a better public manager.
Yes, excellent. Yes, you had some of that conflict right up front.
Yeah.
And Marian, this similar
it's
kind
all
of
about
experience.
Connections.
Yeah. What are those connections for you when you started at Point Pelee?
Well, I graduated from university, and my professor, botany professor, got a phone call, and Parks Canada was looking for somebody who could do a contract on invasive species at Point Pelee. And that's how I started my career. And interestingly, that's where I ended my career too.
Yeah. So that time spent at those places, I want to kind of back up a little bit and talk about some geological history. Again, these places are separated by a billion years. When we go to the Keweenaw or go to Royale, those are some of the oldest rocks you stand on in the whole world, right?
Right. The world is about 4.5 billion years, give or take a half a billion. And Royale is part of 450 lava flows. And when you walk the spine of the park or the Keweenaw Peninsula, you're on some of the oldest rock that ever came out of the oceans. So there's a timeless quality to that park that's purely amazing, but it also sets the park up for a very different transition zone. It actually is boreal on one end, so it connects with Canada, and it's hardwoods on the southern end, so it's more like a lot of the places south of it. But it also has what's called Arctic disjunct species, and it has it has some species of plants from the Pacific Northwest that, don't ask me how they're at Royale, and they're in the Pacific Northwest, but it's very unique flora and fauna and geology.
And so, but at the opposite end of the spectrum, Point Pelee, that does have some relics that are old, but 10,000 years ago,
we're
it
considered
was,
relatively
it
young.
was scoured off by glaciers.
That's
So
right.
It's a very dynamic system that has a disturbance and wind and wave and energy. So what about a little bit about Point Pelee?
Well, basically, the peninsula on which the park sits on a ridge built of fragments.
Rubbles.
Rubble
Rubble from
that's
us,
right. And it divides the western basin and the central basin of Lake Erie. And you're absolutely right. It's a sand spit. But interestingly, it may only be about 15 square kilometers, which is about, I think, 8 square miles. It's pretty small, but the complexity, we have one of the largest remaining Great Lakes marshes, we have forest, swamp, and dryland. And the interesting part about us is we're on the northern edge of what's considered eastern deciduous forest, which is eastern North America. Yeah.
So we can talk about those kind of the wildlife and the wildness and the habitat types, but what are some other aspects of wild places that people don't necessarily normally think about?
Well, I think people forget about soundscapes and night skies. Basically, at our Royale, it's one of the most phenomenal places to watch the northern lights or to sit and watch Venus come out of Lake Superior. It's just a spectacular night sky, but it actually can be influenced by Canadian city on the far side and also then soundscapes. I can sit on my dock and I can hear the compressive sound of a raven flying over when his wings do the wing stroke. I mean, that's how quiet it is out there unless Lake Superior is acting up and then you can't hear anything but waves.
Yeah, do you see some of those same experiences on Lake
Yeah,
Erie?
very, very much the sound and the night skies. And for us, it's a real challenge because if you think about where we are in the very southern part of the Great Lakes, we're talking about a sea of humanity. And we're a wild place in amongst that. So for us, it's the whole idea of once you step inside the boundaries of the national park, it's like you're in this oasis, and the absence of any kind of man-made or manicured landscape, it just is calming, has a really calming influence.
So real quickly, what do you see as some of the big threats or that we're worried about on some of these places? Just off the top of your head, the kind of general list.
For us, it's fragmentation. The size, for us, our ecosystems are so small, there's no buffer zone, so if processes are absent or there's invasives, it's a big deal.
And you mentioned a few things for our Royale that we don't necessarily think about.
Yeah, our Royale, it's the things that are hard to deal with or control. It's climate change, altering the temperature of lakes. I may lose one of my first species, a fish species, at our Royale this year. We may document its passing. It also is airborne pollutants coming in from long distances and, of course, invasive species.
Yeah, so those are going to be some good fodder for some questions. So, Christy, I think we might have some questions from the studio audience.
All right, so let's open it up. You've already started to hear a little bit about wild places and some of the concerns we have. Who has a question here in the studio audience? Anybody have a question? This young lady right here? Come on over here. All right, go ahead. Tell us your name.
Carly Doran.
Okay, Carly, and go ahead. What's your question?
What are some of the wildest things that you guys have seen in these places?
Well,
Go ahead.
all right, I'll go for the wildest. This one's really up close and personal for me. It's probably a eastern fox snake, which is a rare and endangered snake. And they get to be about 6 to 8 feet long, one hanging off my hand.
Oh.
He was a terrified, he or she was a terrified snake that I was trying to rescue. They were basking in the sun on the road, and so I had gone to pick it up and snapped on and did not let go until I walked to the side and laid it into the grass, and then it let go. And so that was pretty cool because, like I said, they're 8-foot snakes, they're constrictors, they're pretty impressive.
Phyllis, any wild experiences?
Yeah, I actually got to watch 2 eagles fledge over the course of several weeks' time. Before I started work at 8 o'clock on a visitor center in Lake Winnebagoshish, I would go to the nest and I would watch them. And you would think that it's just all intuitive. There was a lot of conversation going on in this whole process. We don't have enough time to go into it, but it was just wonderful to watch. And I saw one on the first flight off, and it was really spectacular.
Wow. Anybody else have any questions? Come on over here, ma'am. Stand right here. Go ahead, tell us your name.
I'm Judy Kelly.
Okay, Judy, what's your question?
I have a question about climate change and imperiled species. What options have been taken to protect them, because the plants can't migrate north as the climate migrates north? And so are they going to be moved to new habitats, or what can happen?
Thanks,
You
Judy.
want to start?
That's a complex question. For us, we're on the edge of, as I mentioned, a range. So we constantly are seeing new species being introduced, and we have been doing a lot of restoration work, which creates new spaces for these species to move in. So.
Yeah, I think genetic banks are going to be pretty critical in the future, especially for plant species where you can do it. At the park itself, it has enough of a transition zone. I'm afraid what we'll lose is the Arctic disjuncts, but they are they are up in the Arctic. They've been separated since glaciation, though, so I think we have a different genetic setup on our. But we've never spent the money to really sort it all out. So right now I would tell you we're struggling to figure it out, and it's something we need to struggle with the public with a little bit more, because there's no easy answers.
I think one of the controversies is when to intervene and when not to intervene, which is really no particular answer for.
And I want to pick up on something that Mary said and ask you, you talked about restoration. Are restoration projects more difficult or any different in some of these wild places than when we're talking about other habitats?
Yeah, I would say not so much different, but much more research is required, much more sourcing of your seed banks, and then also to the growing of those to propagate them, to bring them back into the park. So there's a whole science just being built in itself in restoration, because it's becoming more and more of a requirement in order to protect and preserve wild places.
All right, do we have one last question we want to get to? Hi, ma'am, come on over here. Hello, what's your name?
Veronica Gracia Wing.
Okay, Veronica, go ahead and ask your question.
So at the top of the show, you chatted a bit about some of the larger things that we could do as Great Lakes residents to make an impact and preserve and conserve these spaces. What are some of the more everyday things that we can do as Great Lakes residents to help these spaces?
That's a great question. Thank you very much.
You know, one of my favorite things is I have wild places in my backyard. I landscape with native plants from the region. I try to provide the basics, you know, the food and the shelter and the water, because I think you can have that wildness or those wild experiences in your backyard, as well as these majestic or wonderful backyard places we go to.